Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one literally involves the brain, and that we're going to be discussing the various parts of that particular organ. Now, just a reminder, this is an introductory psychology lecture, so if you're hoping for great in-depth knowledge of the brain and its many myriad parts, you're going to be disappointed. What we're going to do here is skim the surface to essentially point out what needs to be known for this class, and if you ever take an anatomy class or such, believe me, you're going to be learning a whole lot more about it. Now, the brain itself tends to be subdivided somewhat arbitrarily into three parts. The first part is called the hindbrain, H-I-N-D brain, and then there's the midbrain, M-I-D brain, and then there's the forebrain, F-O-R-E brain. Now, these were named in animals for the most part, and it made perfect sense, because in animals, their spinal cord and brain are on a nice horizontal plane, parallel to the ground, at least if we're talking quadrupeds. Now, then the hindbrain is behind the midbrain, which is in the middle, and the forebrain is in front, so that it makes perfect sense. With humans, unfortunately, because we are bipedal, because we stand on two legs, our brains have some rather interesting, the geography is not as clear. So that the hindbrain, instead of being behind the rest of the brain, is rather below it. And the midbrain is kind of been encapsulated by the forebrain to the point that in the diagram I'm going to show you, you can't even see it. This is a generic diagram, it actually comes from Cicerelli and White, of the brain. We're looking at a cross-section essentially through to point out the various parts. And you can see that it's not a really nice linear thing. It actually sort of comes up part way here, and then it kind of goes that way. So it's not a really perfect plane the way that it would be with other animals. But still, this is the one we're going to be talking about because it's the one that most psychologists are interested in. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to follow the brain from the spinal cord all the way to the very top and talk about a few parts. Now, if you're in my class, generally in my classes, I ask for my students to remember only one or two things for each of these. If you are in a different class and you're watching this for more information, you may need to remember more, or you may need to remember different things. So do keep that in mind. So the spinal cord enters the skull and becomes part of the brain right up through here. It enters the skull through a hole in the skull called the foramen magnum, which, by the way, is Latin for big hole. Sounds a lot better in Latin. And immediately begins to expand into a structure called the medulla. Now, the medulla used to be called the medulla oblongata until apparently recently they dropped the oblongata part. I don't know why. Now it's just the medulla. So for my students, for medulla, what I want you to think is breathing. The medulla handles all sorts of necessary biological functions, but one of the most important is breathing. And indeed, damage to the medulla can cause people to no longer be able to breathe on their own. If a person damages their spinal cord, breaks their neck high enough up, like Christopher Reeve, the actor, played Superman in movies in the 70s, fell off a horse, landed on his head, unfortunately, and he damaged his spinal cord literally right where it exited from the skull. Now, when you damage the spinal cord, it reacts like any other part of the body does when it's injured. It swells up, and it caused immediate damage to his medulla just inside the skull because there's no intersection. There's no disconnect between the spinal cord and the brain. They're each more or less an extension of the other. So the medulla was damaged, and he stopped breathing almost instantly and had to have help with breathing for pretty much the rest of his life. So for medulla, I want people to remember breathing. Now, just sort of in front of the medulla is an area of the hindbrain. The medulla is the hindbrain. So is this, called the pons, P-O-N-S. Now, for pons, I want you to think sleep. Because there is an area in the pons that if it's damaged in an animal, presumably in a human, though it's never really been tested, if you damage it in a rat, for instance, that rat will just sleep and sleep and sleep and sleep and sleep. And it's not a coma. It's perfectly normal sleep, going through all the stages and everything. There's another area that if it's damaged, you can wind up with an animal that will stay awake for days at a time until it kind of keels over into a twitching sleep for a few hours, and then it stays awake some more. By the way, we don't think that in humans insomnia is necessarily caused by damage to the pons. but rather it's almost certainly either behavioral or chemical. And I'll talk more about that when we talk about sleep. So the pons is also part of the hindbrain. And lastly, we have this area right here, right at the back of the skull, which is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum is involved in balance and coordination. It is the cerebellum that allows us to stand upright because that's really complicated. Look at any child, or better yet, look at any drunk. Because one of the first things that alcohol does in your body, and it does all sorts of stuff, one of the first things it does is it starts to knock out your cerebellum. And so people who are drunk can't really stand. They're not coordinated. They fall down. They trip. They stagger. All of that comes because their cerebellum is not functioning very well. And in fact, most of the tests that policemen use, the field sobriety test, standing on one foot and closing your eyes and touching your finger to your nose and whatnot, those are also tests of cerebellum functioning. Because the most common reasons that people's cerebellums aren't functioning is because they're drunk. So, you ever want to know what the cerebellum does? As I said, think of someone who's drunk and see what they can't do. That's what the cerebellum does. The cerebellum is the last part of the hindbrain I'm going to talk about. Now, the midbrain is probably in here somewhere. We don't see it on this diagram. It's probably in here, but I can't really point at something and go, that's the midbrain, the way I can with the hindbrain and the forebrain. So the midbrain has its own slide. Now, the midbrain is involved in any of a number of things, but the most important thing that I want you to remember for it is a small area in the midbrain called the substantia nigra. Now, substantia nigra is Latin for dark or black substance. And in fact, while most of the rest of the brain is either a grayish color, which comes from the cell bodies, or a creamy white color, which comes from myelin on axons, the substantia nigra is a very dark gray. And the substantia nigra is very important in movement. Because there's a disorder you may have heard of in which the substantia nigra is damaged and it affects movement rather immensely. It's called Parkinson's disease. Now, in Parkinson's disease, that is usually marked with a tremor. People start having tremoring problems in their hands and eventually in their, perhaps even in their heads and much of their body tremor. And what happens eventually, if this goes on long enough, is the tremoring gets so extreme that the person is almost frozen. Now, it's not that they're limp frozen. It's that their muscles are just contracting. All of their muscles are. So they're stiff frozen. The less of a substantia nigra the person has, the more frozen the person is going to be. So it's very important. In some ways, it seems to be important in almost initiating movement or perhaps even in some ways suppressing those sort of tremors. But without the substantia nigra, people are in rather deep, dark trouble. Because if you've seen somebody with Parkinson's disease, they may have trouble moving, trouble writing, trouble speaking. It's not a very pleasant disorder, unfortunately. There has actually, by the way, been some research looking at trying to replace the substantia nigra, either with some sort of electrical conduit there, that pathway, or with stem cells to replace the substantia nigra cells. And both of those have met with some success, although it's very, very preliminary. But yes, for the midbrain, substantia nigra involved in movement, destroyed in Parkinson's. Now, all the rest of this brain here is called the forebrain. It is indeed very, very large, in mammals at least, and in humans it's just huge. We see less and less of it. We see less of it in birds, even less of it in reptiles and fish and amphibians, that sort of thing. Now, there's a number of parts in this forebrain. Again, I'm not really going to be able to show you all of them, but I should be able to do a rather quick review. They include, for instance, parts of the brain called the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is located here, very important in memory. Learn more about that in the memory section. But the hippocampus is absolutely vital for memory. We also have the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is sometimes called the master gland because the pituitary gland essentially helps control the endocrine system. Without the endocrine system and the pituitary gland, we're in trouble because it regulates all sorts of things, from growth to puberty to everything else. Now, the hypothalamus right here, well, let's go to the thalamus first. This area here is called the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is what I tend to think of as a way station because input from every sense except for the sense of smell goes through the thalamus. Input from vision through the thalamus. Hearing, taste, touch through the thalamus. The only reason that smell doesn't go through the thalamus is because your olfactory bulbs for smell are right here, right along the bottom of the brain. So the information comes in from your nose right into those bulbs, and they don't need to go through the thalamus because it's right there. So I tend to think of the thalamus as kind of like Atlanta Hartsfield Airport, or any hub airport for that matter. Because if you're going to fly anywhere in the southeastern United States, odds are you're going to change planes in Atlanta. And every sense except for smell goes through the thalamus. Now, just beneath the thalamus in four-legged animals, but kind of in front of it in humans, is an area called the hypothalamus, which is a very important little area. Now, the hypothalamus is involved with what I like to call the 4 F's. The 4 F's are fighting, fleeing or running away, feeding, and I'd like to thank my Catholic school students for this last one, fornication. Fighting, feeding, fleeing, fornication. They're all controlled, at least in some ways, by the hypothalamus. So it is a small area, but a very important one. Now, in addition, we have this whole kind of wrinkly area out here. This is called the cerebral cortex. And it's a rather thin layer over the rest of the brain, but it's where, huge amounts of things happen in this cerebral cortex. Okay? Much of what we think of in psychology of thinking and language and everything else is in the cerebral cortex. But one more small area that I want to point out is the corpus callosum. You can't really see it in this picture. It's this band right here. Now, it should actually be coming out of the picture at you, and if we had 3D, I would be able to do that. But this corpus callosum actually connects the left and right hemisphere of the brain. It allows the two hemispheres of your brain to talk to one another, to send information back and forth. Now, there are a couple of other little areas that there's also a connection. There's one in the thalamus, and I think there might be one in the midbrain somewhere. But for the most part, this little band right here is the only place where the left and right halves of the brain can talk to one another. And as in lateralization, you'll find out that this is rather important, that they do need to talk. Now, like I said, I have just skimmed the surface of the surface of the surface here in terms of the parts of the brain, in terms of what they do. But this should give you an idea of where everything is, what it is, and what it does.